Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. We're really getting into the thick of it today, tackling a topic I know is on everybody's mind as we head into, 2024.
The election.
Exactly, the big one. Specifically, we're diving into public opinion in Florida. You guys have been sending in some fascinating YouTube analysis and commentary, and honestly, it's sparked some debate, even among us.
It has,
Yeah.
and it perfectly illustrates why getting a grip on raw data, like understanding how these polls actually work, is so crucial, especially now.
Right, like everyone's claiming to have the magic formula, but this source we're looking at today, they're coming in with a healthy dose of skepticism, questioning if the whole tight race in Florida narrative we're seeing in the media is even accurate.
Yeah, and they're not just questioning it. They've got their own analysis of these overnight polls weighted to mirror the 2020 electorate in Florida, which, for the record, leans a bit Republican, something they acknowledge up front.
Okay, see, now you're already a few steps ahead of me. What's an overnight poll? And what's this waiting business all about? Break it down for us.
So imagine you've got a major event, a debate, a scandal, something that could shift the political landscape. An overnight poll is like a quick temperature check right after, gauging those immediate reactions.
Gotcha, so it's like a snapshot in time. But doesn't that make it kind of unreliable in the grand scheme of things?
You're absolutely right. They can be influenced by things like, oh, smaller sample sizes for one. Now, weighting. That's where we try to account for those variations and make the poll a better reflection of the actual voters.
So, like, if Hispanic voters were 15% of the 2020 electorate, but are projected to be closer to 20% this time around, weighting adjusts for that.
Exactly. It's about ensuring the sample group you're polling actually mirrors who's going to be casting ballots.
Makes sense. So this source, they're claiming their data, even weighted, shows a massive swing towards Trump in Florida, like an 8-point lead. Compared to his 3-point win in 2020, that's
Huge.
exactly. They even call out sources like Newsweek and Politico specifically, claiming they're pushing this close race narrative that their data just doesn't support. They point to things like the Republican registration advantage, essentially. More registered Republicans in Florida as something those polls might be missing. But 8 points, I mean, that's a landslide in the making. How does that line up with what other polls are showing, even allowing for some wiggle room?
Ah, now that is the question, isn't it? And it highlights why this whole polling game is so tricky. They do mention Real Clear Politics, which pulls data from a bunch of different polls.
So it's like they're trying to get a more well-rounded picture by combining all these different perspectives.
Right, and while Real Clear Politics still shows Trump ahead in Florida, it's nowhere near that 8-point lead this source is suggesting.
Okay, so red flag number one. Maybe we shouldn't be picking out just one data point and running with it. It seems a bit like they're finding the numbers that fit their story, you know?
It's possible, but in the interest of fairness, they do highlight an Emerson College poll showing Trump with a 5-point lead, and they even call Emerson a good pollster.
And they're not wrong. Emerson College does generally have a good reputation for accurate polling.
Right.
So it's like they're acknowledging some polls show a closer race, but are putting more emphasis on the ones that back them up. It all comes back to being careful about accepting any single source as gospel, doesn't it?
Absolutely, especially in something as complex and, frankly, as important as elections. You've got to look at it from multiple angles.
All right, so how about we dive into another one of their big claims? This idea that there's this national trend of voters shifting.
Right.
They talk about how even those typically blue states, here New York's and New Jersey's, are seeing this, so Florida could swing even further than we think.
They're definitely drawing a connection there, and it's a thought-provoking one. But here's the thing about national trends. They don't always translate neatly to specific states or regions.
Right, like what's true for the country as a whole might not be playing out in the exact same way in, say, Miami-Dade County versus, like, rural Florida.
Exactly. Context is everything. For example, they suggest that some of this shift might be because people are literally moving to Florida from states that had stricter COVID policies.
So they're implying these new residents are more likely to be, what, conservative, pro-Trump.
It seems that way, though. That feels like a bit of a leap, don't you think? I mean, people's political views are far more complex than that. You can't just assume someone's voting preferences based on where they moved from.
Right. It's like saying people in cities like pizza, so everyone in New York City must love deep dish Chicago style. It's just not how it works.
Perfect analogy. And even if we were to assume, just for the sake of argument, that these new residents are more conservative, there's no guarantee they'll all vote, or that they'll all vote the same way.
See, this is why I love these deep dives. We're not just looking at numbers on a screen. We're really getting into the weeds of what those numbers mean or sometimes don't mean. It's so easy to get caught up in a simple narrative, but the reality is always more complicated, wouldn't you say?
100%. And it gets even more interesting when this source starts to break down the demographics of who's actually voting in Florida.
Okay, so we're going deeper into specific groups within the electorate. I'm guessing they're looking at how different demographics might be leaning. That seems like a whole other rabbit hole.
It is, and they make some pretty bold claims. For example, they emphasize that at a national level, their data shows Trump performing well among black voters. And they suggest this could be a factor in Florida, too.
But wouldn't that depend on who those black voters are? Florida's got an incredibly diverse population.
That's exactly the kind of critical thinking we need. It's tempting to see a national trend and assume it applies everywhere, but it's almost never that simple. Florida's black population includes Caribbean Americans, African immigrants, longtime black residents. I mean, you're talking about completely different histories and voting patterns.
Right, like you can't just lump everyone together based on one demographic marker. It's like saying birds can fly, so penguins must be able to soar through the air. It doesn't work that way.
Exactly. They even say Trump's doing almost as well as he is nationally among black voters in Florida, but without actually breaking down those subgroups, that statement is almost meaningless.
So are they being intentionally misleading or just oversimplifying? What do you think?
It's tough to say for sure, but it does highlight why we can't just take data at face value, right? They're clearly pushing a narrative, and we need to be very aware of that.
Okay, so red flag number 2. Broad generalizations without the nuance. What else are they missing?
Well, they do something similar with Hispanic voters, which, as you know, are a huge voting bloc in Florida.
Huge. And again, just like with black voters, it's an incredibly diverse group.
Yeah.
Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, they all have different priorities, different experiences, different political leanings.
You're preaching to the choir. But this source, they kind of gloss over those nuances. They point to national polls showing Trump doing well with Hispanics, suggesting that this will give him an edge in Florida.
But didn't we just talk about how national trends don't always translate directly to specific states?
Exactly. And to be fair, they do acknowledge that Florida's Hispanic population, particularly the Cuban American community, has historically been more conservative.
So it's not necessarily a new trend that's going to massively swing the election. It's more like they're taking an existing pattern and trying to make it seem like a game changer.
You got it. And that's a common tactic we see in data analysis, especially when someone's got a dog in the fight, so to speak. They're selectively highlighting the pieces of the puzzle that fit their picture while conveniently ignoring the parts that don't.
Which is exactly why it's so important to be aware of those tactics and to approach all data, all analysis with a critical eye. It's not just about the numbers themselves, it's about how those numbers are being presented and interpreted.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that brings us to another super important point, methodology. What they've talked about how they're using overnight polling data and weighting it to match the 2020 electorate, but
they're not exactly giving us a peek behind the curtain, are they?
exactly. It's like they're giving us the Cliff's Notes version of a research paper without the actual data or methodology section.
Which, let's be real, is the most important part. How can we assess the validity of their findings without knowing how they actually collected and analyzed that data? For all we know, their sample size could be minuscule, or they might not have factored in certain biases.
All of which could totally skew the results. And then there's the issue of comparing their data to other polls. They focus on a select few that support their narrative, like that Emerson College poll we talked about.
Right, the one they called good.
Yeah, but what about all the other polls out there?
The ones that might tell a different story.
Exactly. And they completely gloss over those. For instance, 538, another well-respected polling aggregator, they have a completely different model that considers things like expert forecasts and economic data, and their projections for Florida, much closer than what this source is claiming.
So it's not just about cherry-picking data points. It's about the models and methodologies used to analyze that data.
100%. It's like using different maps to navigate the same city. You might reach the same destination eventually, but the routes you take and the information you encounter along the way will be completely different.
This is making me realize just how important it is to consult multiple sources, multiple methodologies, and to be aware of the biases and limitations of each. You can't just rely on one map or one poll or one YouTube video to give you the full picture.
Exactly. It's about triangulating information, looking for both the patterns and the discrepancies, and being open to the possibility that the truth might lie somewhere in between different perspectives.
Okay, so with all of that in mind, what should our listener take away from the source's claims about a potential Trump landslide in Florida? Are they onto something? Or is this just a case of cherry-picked data and misleading interpretations?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer. But here's the thing. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer. But here's the thing. This source's analysis, it might actually have some valid points buried in there. Like, it's entirely possible we are seeing a rightward shift in some demographics.
It's just not the guaranteed landslide they're making it out to be.
Exactly. And that's the key takeaway here. This isn't about dismissing their analysis entirely. It's about giving you, the listener, the tools to analyze it.
Right, like put on your skeptic hats, everyone.
Exactly. They raise some valid questions about how these big kind of sweeping factors we've all lived through, like COVID-19 policies, migration patterns, how those might be influencing the electorate.
They specifically brought up the backlash, against lockdowns, mandates, that whole debate, suggesting that it could push some voters, especially in a place like Florida, where things were less restrictive than other parts of the country, towards Trump.
Right, and they argued that this backlash is part of a larger trend, something they see happening nationally. Whether it's enough to sway a whole election, that's debatable.
So how do we even begin to untangle that? It's not like pollsters are asking people, did COVID restrictions make you more likely to vote Republican?
You're hitting on the limitations of polling. You can ask about opinions, but those underlying motivations, that's where it gets really, really complex. You've got to look beyond the numbers, consider broader social trends, economic anxieties, even cultural shifts, to understand what's truly motivating voters. It's about connecting those dots.
So COVID is a dot, the economy's a dot, maybe even things like crime rates, education. They're all dots that we need to connect to get the bigger picture.
Precisely. And that's what makes these deep dives so valuable. It's not just about this one source or even just about Florida. It's about understanding how to be a critical consumer of information, especially during something as, let's face it, as charged as an election year.
Because, let's be real, we're bombarded with data these days from all sides. And it's so easy to get caught up in a compelling narrative, even if the evidence is, well, let's just say it needs a closer look.
Exactly. So, to circle back to that initial question, should you be worried about a potential Trump landslide in Florida based on this one YouTube video?
I'd say be cautiously skeptical.
Skeptical of their conclusion, but not necessarily dismissive of the points they're raising. Exactly. Don't just write them off completely. Take what they're saying, dig a little deeper, look for evidence that either supports or contradicts their claims, and this is key. Don't rely on any single source for your information, especially in this day and age.
So it's like if this deep dive was a detective show, we're not saying this source is guilty of spreading its information, but there's definitely enough probable cause to warrant a closer look.
You're getting it. You be the detective. Use the tools we've talked about, multiple sources, different methodologies, understanding demographic nuances, questioning everything. Use those tools to examine the evidence.
This has been eye-opening. I feel like we started out trying to understand one source's take on Florida, and we've ended up with a master class in media literacy. What are some parting words of wisdom for our listeners as they continue their own election deep dives?
Keep asking those tough questions. Don't just follow the headlines. Dig deeper, question your assumptions, and be wary of anyone who presents themselves as having all the answers, because the reality is...
It's complicated.
Exactly. The world of data is complex, it's messy, and it's constantly changing. And the more informed you are, the better equipped you'll be to navigate it.
Beautifully said. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, every election cycle, it brings new challenges, new narratives, new opportunities to really put those critical thinking skills to the test. Keep asking those tough questions, never start seeking out the truth, and we'll catch you next time.